Very nice to be here. Thanks for the introduction, Lorena. And just before I start, it's true on the cover, it's myself and Christin Bernhold as the authors, but we also have our co-author. We consider Dara Layden, who's sitting here to be our co-author, who led on one of the chapters, co-wrote another chapter, and read every single draft of every single chapter. And funny enough, see, I'm a professor, so I assumed, well, these are my junior colleagues, so they'll be listening to me and saying, oh, it's wonderful. But it's the other way around. Every single chapter I wrote, I thought, this is so wonderful. They'd be like, no, 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 no. It's like worse than doing a PhD. Every single chapter was like 10 drafts at least, if not 20. And it's partly Dara's fault. But that's why it's a very good book, I think, because it just went through so many iterations. And we were also mean to each other as well. So it was all pain, pain, pain for 5 years. I even said, when we started it, I said it'd take 6 months to write. It took about 5 years. But, that's how things go. So we're talking about these happy subjects here. And I don't know if they're... Yeah, so this is the cover. And the cover denotes rusting chains. Rust is obviously not shiny and brilliant, because most of the books you get, if you just do a Google search on books about global value chains or global supply chains, you've got the most banal set of book covers, all Shutterstock, dynamic tankers, or a world with electronic fuzz around it. Or, if it's a little bit critical, you'll have a picture of the Ever Given, that ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Oh my God, supply chain problems. And it's that is what you have. Okay, so this is completely opposite to that. It's a discomforting picture, because what we're talking about are things that have totally screwed up the world and made our lives in many ways more precarious. And these are causal factors in raising the rate of labour exploitation across the world, increasing nature destruction, and increasing geopolitical tensions. It's not some external event that just happens. These are causal factors in these problems that we face. And yet, again and again and again, you see people writing for the World Economic Forum or Forbes, global supply chains are this solution to the food crisis, for example. Global supply chains can solve every single crisis, I'm surprised that I say, if you've got problems in your marriage, global supply chains will sort them out. I mean, they can. You can get all kinds of tech to kind of do stuff, but it's like that's the logic. So I'm going to go on and do this critique of global supply chains based on this book now. But I'll just start off, as we usually do, by noting what they are and why it's an important perspective and what we and I owe to the people we're going to critique. So to start off with, global value chains or global supply chains or global production networks are basically systems of fragmented production across borders. Computers, cell phones, whatever, are produced not in one country, but in many countries. Contrast that to the Ford motor car 100 years ago, and you see a dynamic reshaping of production across borders. It accounts for around 70% of international trade, and it is a fundamentally important substructure of global production. And so here is another of those types of covers here from the World Bank Development Report. Positive cover, all that light denoting progress, the stages of growth. We're moving towards a more dynamic world where there's more light. But of course, that is all based on energy extraction. And what is the downside of that? They kind of recognize it, but they don't really go into it, whereas we do. So we talk about this. What is the value? Given that this book and this presentation is going to be critiquing the idea of global value chains, I should say what is valuable about it. The idea goes back to world systems approach in the 1970s and 80s, but it really comes to fruition with Gary Gareffi in 1994 in his book, Commodity Chains and Global Capitalism. And what was so useful about this book at that time was this was a moment of free market triumphalism. There is no alternative to the market, and yet he shows, and his colleagues show, that trade was not free. Free trade doesn't exist, okay? It is managed. Not only is it managed, it's driven. These large firms, the lead firms, control trade. They structure it. They decide what is produced. And the GVC approach is extremely useful. If you want to go down the road to a part of London, the City of London, and see what decisions they're making in the boardrooms about what kind of products they want to be produced and imported and so on, you can say, okay, so these guys are making they are having discussions, they're making decisions here. Let me then get a plane to northeast Brazil, which is where I did my PhD research, or to Thailand, where Dara did his research, or to Argentina, where Christin did her research, and see what the impact of these decisions are on the ground. What are the developmental or disdevelopmental impacts there? So the GVC approach is extremely useful, and it remains very useful. So that is a great thing. And the fact that it punches the myth of free trade is also a great thing. So for these reasons, all of us, the authors of this book, are indebted in a way to Gary Garefi and others for popularizing and making usable the approach of the GVC or GCC approach. I use the words GCC, GVC, GPN all interchangeably, even though there are some difference, and global supply chains. But that's the necessary tipping of the hat to those academics. But this is then the critique. This book shows that what they've done is to, in a sense, reify and inject with the modernization theory mentality or set of expectations the concepts that they use to describe and explain the existence, the reproduction, and the developmental benefits of global value chains or global supply chains. So we do all of this in the book, and every single chapter, I would say, is original in the sense that it breaks new ground in relation to the mainstream GVC literature, and also in terms of in relation to critical GVC literature. When we draw on, we consider ourselves part of the critical GVC crowd, but we also try and push it a bit further. So these individual chapters are original, but the sum of the parts is also, I'd say, more original, hopefully. Just a few kind of pointers. What has happened over the last 35 years since globalization has really expanded after the fall of the involution of the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc is that some firms have become so big, some corporations are now bigger than national economies. So if you took a company by revenue, Walmart, Amazon, and Apple, for example, are bigger than Argentina, Austria, and South Africa, respectively. So you see a transformation, the concentration and the enlargement of capital in a way that is transformational for the worse, but transformational nevertheless. Now, what we do in this book is the critical GVC approach over the last 20 years or so, 25 years or so, has done a great job, and we have contributed to that, but we're only a small number of quite a large crowd of people contributing to critical GVC analysis. We have done class analysis within global value chains. Most of the time, that class analysis is at the supplier end, looking at labor conditions, for example. Sometimes it looks at value capture strategies of lead firms and so on. So it's class analysis using Marxist and other critical concepts to analyze the developmental disbenefits of global supply chains, global value chains. What we do is we push it further and say we are not just doing class analysis in global value chains, we are doing class analysis of global value chains. We see global value chains, global supply chains, global productions networks as themselves not a technical structure, but a structure of appropriation of surplus value from labor, appropriation of nature with immensely destructive effects. So in that sense, we see the chain as this structure, and we use notions like international class relations to explain that. Our conception of class is classical Marxist, where we see class relations as relations between an exploiting and an exploited class. So one class can systematically extract, get hold of, sometimes live off the surplus labor created by another class. This is historical, goes back, but in our way we're thinking about it, this is international. A lot of really good Marxist work suffers from a kind of methodological nationalism where these class relations are seen within the national container. And that's, you know, the transition debates, when you look at them in the 1970s, they were amazing. They were really enlightening, brilliant pieces of work. But these class relations are not contained within national states. They exist dialectically. They're formed within nation states, but they are formed also in dialectical relation to class dynamics elsewhere. And for us, the key example is that between Silicon Valley within the US and China and the kind of the industrial zones in China. And we see these as international class relations, where you have the formation of a massive capitalist class on one hand and a huge working class on the other. Now, let me just go through some of the key ideas. The key approaches of the GVC approach, and this is what really sells it to the policy types. If you go back to the that document, the World Bank Development Report from 2020, which Dara and I wrote a critique of, and that report is based upon the idea that all countries can benefit from global value chains, that upgrading is a universal and universalizing strategy that can lead to development. As Gary Garefi says in his work, upgrading is a new paradigm of development, right? If he were to say it's a new paradigm of uneven development, I'd agree with him and we wouldn't have written this book. But he's saying, no, it's a new paradigm of development. Forget industrialization, forget national industrial structures like the South Korean model. What you need to do is integrate into these sectors and which are internationally organized and upgrade within them. And there are a range of upgrading processes that can take place: product, process, function, chain, entering a new market. So this can entail producing something better, producing it more efficiently, taking on other activities such as branding, moving into different chains, or even going into a new market altogether. And this is a very powerful way of thinking, powerful because, as Garefi says, it's a new paradigm of development, and it's rooted in modernization theory, which is like a religion, which basically says it is open to all. What is good for one is not bad for someone else. What is good for one firm is not necessarily replicable, but it can be generalized across all firms. And modernization theory is, in that sense, reproduced here. Okay, so modernization theory is methodological nationalist. This is not. This is methodological kind of globalist or internationalist in the sense that it sees beyond borders. So that's a benefit that it took from world systems approach, but it reproduces the modernization theory of generalizable development, whereas world systems theory said that development is a myth. Generalizable development is a myth. So there's that transformation. So what about the fallacy? Why is upgrading such a fallacy? First of all, it rests upon labor exploitation. What is really clear is that in the age of, as the World Bank calls it, the age of global value chains, you've also had the establishment of the biggest working class in world history in China. Hundreds of millions of workers have been created and established in China. And this is basically the bedrock, the sociological bedrock of these supply chains. And a lot of the GVC literature, like the World Bank literature, talks about this labor force just in terms of cheap labor. It doesn't talk about class relations or any of the processes that were entailed in order to get this labor force able to work for very long hours. Secondly, it rests on nature destruction. I'll go into this more in a moment. Thirdly, it rests on uneven development. What is good for one could be bad for others. I mean, this is a really simple point, but once you accept it, you can't say that it's generalizable and it can't be a new paradigm of development. And you might as well think of it as an exclusive paradigm for some firms. But I'll just give a couple of examples. In the 1990s, Vietnam became a huge coffee producer, entered the global coffee market, upgraded, achieved significant developmental success through that type of upgrading, but knocked out coffee producers in sub-Saharan Africa, in Central and Latin America. Another example, China its industrialization has been very impressive for many reasons, and we can talk about that later. But what has been the obverse of it, or one of the other sides of it? Well, you've had deindustrialization and reprimarization in places like Brazil and Argentina. Huge expansion of soy, huge expansion of beef, contraction of industry. Now, I'm no fan of industry for the sake of industry. I don't believe that industrialization is the answer to problems of development. But those people who talk about industrialization will be very disappointed with the fact that GVCs lead to that kind of uneven development, reprimarization. They are geopolitically charged. I'll talk about that in a moment. And obviously, we're living through extreme geopolitical moments with the US obviously completely illegal. You don't know. US equals illegal, whatever it does in terms of its intervention. Take that as a given. And people say, oh my God, it's going to have terrible effects on supply chains. But they were geopolitically charged from the first moment. And they underpin global class polarization. As I mentioned, Silicon Valley, you've got these tech bros, these great intellectuals, the standard of civilization is there. I mean, they do think of themselves like that. Peter Thiel says, I want to live until 102. But I've got news for him. I've seen his photo. He's not going to live till 102. Do a bit of exercise to start with. But anyway, that's not for me. I'm not shaming him. But, you know, these people are not these Schumpeterian entrepreneurs with a great motivating force. I mean, they've been supported by the US state from the get-go. They have been rewarded by the restructuring class relations in the United States, where you have this huge precarious labor force, which they are based on. But fundamentally, their wealth is based upon the labor of hundreds of millions of Chinese workers earning below subsistence wages. And they have to make it up by working overtime. 60, 70, 80-hour weeks is common in the tech sector. And so what you have is this transfer of value from China to the tech sector in Silicon Valley, amongst others. But that's the most extreme example. Here is just an example, one image that we have in the book. In many countries in the world, working hours have come down over the last 30 years or so, according to our world in data, but not in China. They've actually gone up. What you've seen in China is what we talk about in the book as a combination of, in Marxist terms, relative and absolute surplus value appropriation. Absolute surplus value is lengthening the working day. Relative surplus value is the intensification of production with new technologies. And this is exactly what you have there. You have not had just relative surplus value, you have had both. And this creates this huge amounts of surplus value, which can then be seized and deployed by tech firms in San Francisco, but also the emerging and very powerful Chinese capitalist class at the moment. Now, why is the mainstream GVC approach so incapable of understanding the developmental disbenefits of their chosen object of analysis? I mean, when Gary Geraghty talks about it, he says, you know, he recognizes uneven development, and he says the problem is it's just that the benefits of upgrading have not been spread widely enough. Well, that's the same as the World Bank saying, well, the reason these countries are poor is because they're not sufficiently integrated into the world market. We need to help them integrate more. It's a typical residualist approach that fails to look at the actual object of analysis and show how they generate uneven development themselves. And what this is based upon is Schumpeter's idea of innovation. Now, Schumpeter was a great political economist. He had this notion of creative destruction, creation and destruction, two sides of the same coin of capitalist development. And what these guys have done, the GVC mainstream, is to take the notion of creation and link it to the idea of innovation and to upgrading, and to very cleverly, for ideological reasons, just get rid of the notion of destruction. So you have creation, you have creative creation, which is naive, because it generates destruction at the same time, as I've shown. Uneven development and exploitation, nature exploitation, is all built into the innovation process under global value chains. So they've really dumbed down Schumpeter's approach. And Schumpeter had actually, I wouldn't say dumbed it down, but he had watered it down compared to where he got it from, which was Marx, which talks about these things. But they take it much further. They also suffer from firm centrism. What they do is quite effective. They look at the relationship between firms, and they provide a lot of conceptual categories and ways of thinking about the relationship between firms that is useful for doing research. But what they do is they abstract these firms from their capitalist system, from which they arise and to which they contribute to reproducing on an ever greater scale. So they abstract it, and they don't theorize that abstraction. They abstract it from the capital-labor relation, they abstract it from geopolitics, they abstract it for the relationship between capital and nature, and GVCs and nature. So all of these things are just left behind, and they're not integrated in any way, which is a real problem. They have no class analysis, and fundamentally they have no theory of value. Even they're talking about global value chains, they don't have a theory of value. They have a theory of value capture. They talk very cleverly about rents and about value capture strategies by lead firms, but they never discuss where that value is created in the first place. So this is a low-level theoretical concept, which has huge political power, as seen by the World Bank using it, WTO using it, and so on. It's fit for kind of low-level theory, but nothing more, and yet it has this power. So what we do is we start from class analysis. We don't bring it back in. We start from class analysis in the first place. We talk about international class relations, the way they're constituted internationally, nationally, and internationally in a dialectical form. We talk about how capitalism rests upon the appropriation of nature, the social construction of nature as a provider of free gifts, and the ability to ever more destroy it than appropriate it. And we talk about thinking about going beyond global value chains. Now, I just want to talk for a few minutes about other elements. So the imperialist chain is our conception of the way states exist in the world economy and their relationship to global value chains and the kind of core technologies that emerged. Why is this important? Because when you look at the early global value chain research in the mid-1990s and the 2000s, and you look at the global production network, especially GPN 2.0 approaches, they purposely and deliberately say we are excluding consideration of geopolitics, or they just don't talk about geopolitics. Geopolitics is out there. And part of the reason is these approaches emerged in the 1990s, 2000s, when liberal peace theory was really prevalent, the Golden Arches theory of peace and peaceful interaction. And so there was no need, they felt, for a serious consideration of geopolitics. Well, they're obviously wrong. You can see that now, but you can also see it when you go back to the beginnings. Where did the core technologies that underpin the evolution and expansion of global value chains come from? What are these core technologies? These are digital technologies, computer chips, digital technologies that can facilitate precise shipping inventories, precise timing of production and delivery. All of these are based on digital technologies. The internet, all of this comes from big investments by the United States government through NASA, through DARPA, through its big agencies set up in the Cold War period to defeat the Soviet Union, to give US and US firms a technological lead over its rival and other countries in around the world. And so geopolitics was there from the start. And we've written about this in this article, Geopolitical Underpinnings of GVCs and Production Networks. And this whole conception of US-made global capitalism was based on the idea that, yes, there'd be lots of growth. Yes, countries could pursue national industrialization. But yes, they could use import substitution industrialization, and they could have tariffs against some US goods, for example, to produce their national economies. That was all in the name of fighting against communism. That was all possible. But what you could not have is a country becoming a real challenger to the United States. Like Japan in the 1980s, Plaza Accords, a devaluation of the US dollar in relation to Japanese currency. And now with China, it's like, it's not possible for you to develop. You have to get back in your box and provide us with cheap goods, but you cannot become a tech challenger to us. Otherwise, we will do what we're doing now and what Biden was doing and what Trump 1 was doing and what Obama were doing, which was pivoting to Asia and trying to contain China's rise. So geopolitics is there from the beginning. Now, this is just another example here. People talk about, oh my God, China is going to be so powerful. This is one image, and there are many possible images you could have. This is GDP per capita. If you just had GDP, you'd get a very different image. But it's important to see that the US has got very high GDP per capita, and China is nowhere near a competitor in terms of GDP per capita. If you did it in PPP terms, it'd be different. If you looked at it in GDP terms, it'd be different. But it is a sign that the US is very much the prime power. People talk about, well, is this moment, post-2008, post-pandemic, right now, is this the end of global value chains, this endless speculation? Well, at the time we were writing, we found this very useful report showing that the distance of goods traveling around the world being transported was rising consistently, even through and after the post-2008 moment. So global value chains, the global supply chains are here to stay for many reasons. One of them is because all of that technology relies upon resources that are mined and produced around the world. It would be quite hard actually to cut out large chunks of the world. We are in a sense reliant on this globalized system of production for the technology through which we relate. This is just an image of global value chains and nature destruction. I realize this is all really happy stuff, but part of the reason for us writing this book was to demystify what the mainstream are doing. And I think being demystifying something is objective in and of itself. And it may not make you feel happy, but at least you see better what's going on and you're not deluded and you're not living a deluded life, which is what they want people to live. So global value chains and nature destruction. I've written another piece about this here. Now, our argument is that global supply chains or capitalist value chains destroy and appropriate nature, not in parallel with its exploitation of labor, but through the exploitation of labor. Simultaneously, it exploits labor through its appropriation of nature. And you can see this. The transformation of nature into private property for capital was based upon the clearances of the original occupants of the land, the transformation of them into a wage labor force, and the use of workers to work on means of production with ever greater capital intensity based upon the ability of capital to appropriate nature and turn nature into means of production. So this means that you have an ever greater upward spiral. If you compare, for example, a miner or a worker in a pin factory 200 years ago with a software or anyone working in an office, just think how much technology we have at our disposal now. The cloud, this huge structure, very material, very deep, and so on, is much, much, much greater than the structure of the pin factory or the mine. And this means that you have a systematic increase in the appropriation of labor, surplus value, and of nature. And this is then exacerbated through hyper-specialization, where you have transportation, ships, ports, railroads, roads, data servers, etc., connecting this huge system all together. And we talk about nature destruction in several ways. And one of them is to think about nature destruction through the way that nature is constructed. So animals have they are sentient beings. They have an intelligence, they have their needs, and yet capital treats animals as private property, means of production, and it completely abstracts from and denies them their needs. And you can see this in the livestock sector with a total degradation of these animals on a mass scale. Billions are killed every year. And this is one of the ways that they do this, that capital does this. And what I find quite shocking is that you have people within the mainstream GVC community who recognize the effects of hyper-specialization on the world. They recognize that global value chains are contributing to the problems we face in this moment. And their answer is typical, and you could have predicted it in the future. What is the problem with global value chains? Well, they're not sufficiently green, so we need to upgrade them. We need to have more value chains and we need to make them environmentally upgraded. And here is the definition. Any change that results in the reduction of the firm's ecological footprint when the net gains in environmental improvement are more than the losses. Now, these are, I ran this past my daughter, she's 12. And I said to her, look, let me ask you this question. Imagine a situation where we have the beautiful Amazon forest, okay? Let's cut half of it down and use it as soy. Let's cut half of it down and use that for livestock, okay? That will create a big problem, won't it? Of course it will. She looks at me. She says, well, yeah. She looks at me and says, yes, that's true. And then I say, okay, but what we're going to do is we're going to improve it. We're going to environmentally upgrade it. So what we're going to do is we're going to, instead of ploughing the soy, we're going to have special forms of fertilization, precision fertilization, where you just enter the fertilizer where it's needed. Maybe we're going to use drones to tell when it's needed. We're going to feed, and I said to her, that the livestock create lots of methane. I said, yes, well, we can feed them seaweed and they'll have less methane. And she's looking at me like, so what do you think about that? That's environmental upgrading. And then she says to me, yeah, but Daddy, you're not going to replant the forest, are you? And I was like, yeah, but this is not my idea. I'm saying this is their idea. And she's looking at me like WTF? Looking at me like, like what an idiot. You know, it's quite intimidating when your little daughter looks at you like something's wrong with you, you know. But it's like, this is the argument. They want environmental upgrading within chains that have already caused a huge, massive effect on the environment, destroying the forest, destroying the sea, destroying nature every single day. And what their argument is, we can just tinker with it and make it a little bit of environmental upgrading. And it's win-win because it upgrades the environment and it has more growth. They don't even think about the consequences of more growth. This is outside their purview. It is incredible. I mean, a lot of these people are in. I mean, you know, they're not engaged with the deep theories. Let's put it that way. Okay, what is to be done exactly? 5 minutes left. I added this after my first couple of presentations because a lot of people in the audience complained afterwards because they say, well, you know, this critique's fine, but it leaves us a bit miserable and we want to know what the solution is. We want to know what the policy is, they said. And I was like, okay, so I'll try and do that. But one of the problems with thinking about policy, in inverted commas, is that often policy is stuff that Keir Starmer does. You know, you take a structure and it's not good, and then you sort of tinker about a little bit. You say, oh, this is policy. You have that fake smile that politicians have, and it's like, this is policy, and they try and get you to buy into it. And that's the problem with policy, so-called. I'm not against policy. I'm for progressive policy. But fundamentally, what we need to understand is that the problem is not the wrong policy, it's the wrong system. It's capitalism that is a problem, and we need to understand that. It's capitalist value chains that is a problem. This is the problem. So we need to think about these things and critique it. And so as we put it in the conclusion, the upgrading, whatever the problem is in global value chains, you can predict, oh, there's a problem. Let's have some more type of upgrading. Let's just think about this new form of upgrading. Resilience, climate change, destroying value chains. Oh, well, we can have more resilience. It's a form of resilience upgrading. But whatever the problem is, more upgrading. But the cure is worse than the disease. It just exacerbates and expands the global value chains, helps more growth. Dara may speak about questions of workers' power within global value chains, which I have not talked about at all in this presentation. But workers' power is very important because it's at the point of production that we can start seeing an alternative way of thinking about the constitution of supply chains and who may be in the position to change them. I do think there are some policies that could really contribute to improving global supply chains. One would be really to shift away from meat, to shift the feed meat complex towards a plant-based system, democratically, not forcing people. I'm not one of these people who says we have compulsory veganism. We can push towards plant-based in many areas, and we can do so through rewilding, turning the land that we rewild into a new commons, recommoning the land, rather than just having it as a kind of privatized area for profit making. We can do that. That is one possible move. Another one is, I mean, there's all these problems with AI and digital technology in terms of environmental impact. But one thing we can think about is moving away from efficiency to sufficiency, because efficient is a never-ending story. You're always going to be trying to be more efficient. It's like under capitalism, you're the donkey and you're chasing the little carrot in front of you to be more efficient, and there's no end because of competitive accumulation. And so what we're talking about is sufficiency. Can we use digital technologies to structure complicated systems of production, draw down a lot of it where possible, exnovation, take technologies out of the system that are damaging, but then to also orientate production with limits on things like water and energy use and mineral use and so on. And if digital technology can be used to shorten the kill chain in Iran, as US bombs it and kills children every single day, it can also be used to benefit production for a more socially equitable and environmentally equitable way. And finally, we talk about economic democracy as a necessity, that is transcending capitalism and transcending the idea of competitive accumulation and having a need-based economy. So this is our so-called policy, but of course it's difficult and it's not a sort of nice bite-sized kind of easy takeaway, but there you go. Thanks very much.
Ben for being on time and for this amazing, thought-provoking and fun presentation. So this is a very dense book, and I invite all of you to read it because as you kind of been very good at giving a taste of it, it touches upon very different dimensions that the mainstream global value chain debate discuss, but using a meta critique that encompasses them all and expose very well the contradictions of what you said is a systemic issue. Okay, so now we have 40 minutes to discuss, and obviously, Dara, you're very welcome to even sit here if you want. And okay, you're gonna say that. But yeah, let's open the floor for questions. I'm gonna get like 2 questions.
Yes.
Please
Sorry, so
introduce
can I-
yourself.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes. Pablo, I'm a PhD student at the econ department. And yes, at the econ department, we have labor reading. And so actually we read a chapter of one of your books there. But anyway, maybe probably you read the next one. But so we talk a lot about class. So there's one that loses surplus, one that appropriates surplus, right? So the issue is, or the complexity comes with the subordinating classes, right? The one that distribute surplus value. So we discussed this a lot, especially with regards to the labor process and so on. So when you talk about the class analysis of global value chains, right? Of the question that comes to my mind all the time, which is like, how should we think about the tertiarization of the global north, the capitalist center economies? Makes you think these are all like growth of the service economies, the growth of the subordinated classes that distribute the surpluses, boost the in the global south. Is this kind of, do we see? Do you do like also an analysis of the subordinate classes and how this shift in the sector shift in the global north is kind of producing all capitalist global north? What are the political maybe repercussions of this?
Right. Okay. Good. 1 and 2. Yes, Frank.
I'm Frank Martinian, postdoc at Geopolitics. I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on how like labor power fits into this, as well as like what other grassroots power and agencies kind of included in the framework that you proposed.
Thank you. Yes.
Hey, I'm Dina Siddiqui. I teach at New York University's London campus, and I want to start off saying I'm an anthropologist, so I can critique without worrying about policy. I don't worry about that at all. So it's very happy, and your talk made me very happy because, you know, it's actually quite incredible to see somebody. I'm not used to, certainly in the US, you do not see any proper presentation saying capitalism is the problem. So it's just not there, and it's fantastic to see it. I'm just here for a year. My question is about what you said about states as capitalist class states. And I've been thinking about what I call, following the anthropologist Anna saying, supply chain capitalism. I've been thinking about Bangladesh in particular. So thinking through Bangladesh about the relationship between the global north and the global south as it comes out through the supply chain, right? And how I think of it as a neo-colonial analysis. You talked about imperialism and class, and I'm wondering what happens when you put in colonialism or neo-colonialism, and in particularly in relation to the law, which you pointed out is post-World War II, or the law much before has always been deeply, deeply imperialist, right? So what does that do? And do you think about places like Bangladesh? You're talking much more about San Jose and elsewhere, but there are other nodes in the global supply chain.
Okay, let's stop here because you have already 3 big questions about tertiarization, global north, labor power, and state law and colonialism. Please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lorena. So, Dara, I can start, and then maybe you want to take up Frank's point? Yeah. Just give you a few seconds to prepare. So Tabo, I mean, that's a great question. We were going to, it would have been earlier, about a year earlier, but because we had this other chapter called Trifurcation of the World Economy, where we talked about how in the global north, to some extent, you've had a kind of white collarization, relative deindustrialization, how you've had industrialization in especially East Asia, China, and you've had reprimarization in places like Latin America. And we were struggling. I mean, that was one of those chapters, it's 10 iterations before we decided we couldn't actually do it. So we decided not to do it. So we were kind of talking about it a little bit there. But we do kind of have oblique references to the imperial mode of living approach and to some approaches in the unequal exchange school that really do see it as a question of global north exploiting global south, and even global northern workers exploiting southern workers, for example. And we argue against that. And this comes back to a little bit about the point about, do we talk about other places? And I'll come back to that in a second. And so one of the things that is, so our notion of international class relations shows how the US, these huge corporations, mostly US firms. I mean, if you look at the tech firms, 9 out of the 10 biggest tech firms are US firms, I think. And they've benefited from a whole restructuring of class relations in the United States, which is far from everyone being capitalist in the United States. No, what we've got this one table in there, which is incredible. You know, productivity from 1950 to, I don't know, 2020 goes up like this. Wages follow behind, but up until about the late 70s, they're kind of going up roughly in the same in proportion, although less, and then they just tail off. And so what you have is this huge transformation. This is a class relational transformation where surplus value has been ever more accrued by the capitalist class and sections of the capitalist class as those sections have become more powerful. And the working class in general in the United States has suffered as a consequence. Now, some of it has become very precarious in places like San Francisco and around Silicon Valley. Other parts have gone up into this more privileged situation of the, the kind of Google offices and the kind of working, not working kind of thing. I mean, they work very hard, and the 996 model is coming for them now, I've heard. But that's 9 till 9, 6 days a week. So we do kind of address this issue in that sense. But I think what you open the question with about the workers, the white collar workers who are involved in digital technologies and in kind of management, so-called, not necessarily managing other workers, but managing stuff. That is a really interesting area for future critical GVC analysis or CVC analysis. I think that would be really great. So anyone who wants to take that up, that would be amazing. Yeah, absolutely. Frank, Dara's going to take Frank's point, and then Dina's point about supply chain capitalism in other parts of the world. So we've got this chapter called Immiserating Growth Regimes, where we say that even in places like China, where you have rising wages, these are immiserating growth regimes because workers do not get paid a subsistence wage within what the ILO considers to be a standard working week of 48 hours. That's our benchmark. We could take the benchmark of the World Bank and have their miserable poverty lines, which is actually impossible to live on, but we take a human benchmark instead, and we see that. And it's not just in places like China. We have case studies in Cambodia, and we have and we've got a case study in Leicester in the UK, where during the COVID pandemic, you had cases of awful working conditions exposed. So during the pandemic, a lot of places were supposed to stop working, but this workers subcontracted by Boohoo's, who produce all these clothes and stuff, were working, many of them immigrant workers, many of them for not having the actual permission, the legal rights to be here. So really, really precarious and really exploited, paid really low, dependent upon access to unemployment benefit. And this was absolutely scandalous. And this is an example of a little node of immiserating growth regimes. And I mean, there are plenty of them. I mean, you can go to agriculture in the United States with Mexican workers, for example, Latino workers, tons of immiserating growth. You've got Amazon and, you know, many of the delivery drivers here have to work extremely long hours to make ends meet. So you have them in many, many places in this sense. So we do talk about others. We don't talk about supply chain capitalism because we talk about capitalist value chains. The difference being that we don't see capitalism as totally determined by the supply chains. There are other games in town, military industrial complexes and so on. Obviously they intersect, but we're trying to be specific in that case. So hopefully that's a reasonable enough answer for now. We can discuss more. But Dara, over to you.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Frank, as well. Do I need to be near the microphone?
Please,
room is mic'd.
Oh.
If you want to,
No, it's
sure.
great. Yeah.
Can you all see Dara? Yes. Okay. And here? Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Frank, for the question. Just to clarify, labor power, do you mean labor power is in the capacity to work or the power of labor to resist exploitation?
For you.
Okay.
I guess like
Okay, there is a
question.
there is a distinction. It comes in a very big way. So first of all, we have a chapter which really specifically looks at labor process and labor agency, and it's called social upgrading from below. And I think this speaks to a little bit about, you know, what can be done, and where potentially the more positive examples of resistance, you know, within these exploitative structures. But also the idea of labor power, the capacity to work, and how that shapes capitalist value chains is pretty central to the theoretical framework that we lay out in the book. So as Ben kind of mentioned, you know, it's very much a dialectical framework. We're looking at kind of historical processes, right, of relocation for you know, more profitable production, but also how capital might also relocate in response to agency. So Beverly Silver's done some kind of great work on this as well, looking particularly at the automotive industry, or she kind of argues that, you know, wherever the automotive industry moved in the global South, resulted in processes of class formation, solidarity. That meant that kind of workers were able to unionize, fight back. The automotive industry therefore moved production to kind of new locations, right? So you have this kind of very dynamic but class relational kind of understanding of uneven development. And in the chapter on social upgrading from below, we do quite a big review of some of the main approaches to kind of looking at labor agency in global value chains as well. So we kind of start with the concept of social upgrading, which, you know, as Ben's mentioned, has some issues, and specifically we critique its neglect of the labor process. So the act of work, right? It's almost there has been some great work within the broader social upgrading literature, right? The issue is the concept itself. It doesn't contain labor process and it doesn't really allow for labor agency. So we move on and we look at the kind of labor geography literature, which has a much richer and I think more fruitful set of case studies in lots of different locations, including Bangladesh, actually. Some great case studies on the garment industry in Bangladesh and the resistance of workers for higher wages and better protections. We also look at the power resources approach, so the concept of structural and associational power, which provide much more of a kind of dialectical and agency-based understanding of like labor resistance, but within the structures of value chains, right? Not just kind of in the abstract or in the particularities of different locations. And that's quite important, but also the power resources approach has been critiqued a little bit for somewhat neglecting kind of the wider political economy. Rather than just looking at particular kind of structures of supply chains, you need to also understand, you know, the constraints to agency in the social formation, right? Whether that's at the national, subnational level, whatever it happens to be. And therefore, we kind of hone in a bit on a more recent framework that's been developed by colleagues at Queen Mary University as well, called the Labour Regime Approach, which some of you may have heard of and are probably familiar with. I won't go into the detail on it, but it's a very kind of fruitful and developing set of concepts, which I also used in my own PhD as well. And finally, we finish with Mark Anner's work. Again, some of you will be familiar with on garment production in Honduras and El Salvador, and that's our kind of case study of social upgrading from below. And his work is fantastic, and I'll leave it there.
Great. We have 3 more questions. Now the next round I'll take. So the team, yes, then lady in the back and Poppy. Okay, ladies first.
Yeah,
Yes.
well,
Okay. Yes. Yes.
Congratulations on the book launch. So as someone who's studying global energy and climate policy here, we talk a lot about geopolitics, global supply chains, and of course renewables. And in fact, this week in a lecture with Verena, we spoke about green transition. And so my question is in the context of just transition. I feel the renewable supply chain is producing the same exploitative dynamics, especially through land grab, resource extraction, and displacement among the indigenous communities, especially in the global south. Do you think there's a way to avoid forms of exploitation while still advancing the energy transition?
Great question. You think she was very attentive in the class? Very good. No, but it shows, sorry, just like it shows very well with the fact that green transition marries very well the contradictions that the environmental upgrade global value chain explains, which is the big failure of the scholarship in general, because we are talking about the same things with different frameworks sometimes. But yeah, thank you.
Great. Cheers, thanks, Serena.
Introduce yourself, please.
Tim, SOAS Development Studies. Thanks, Ben. As inspiring as ever. As I confessed earlier, I haven't managed to steal the book yet from the local bookshop.
Because this costs £100. No one's going to buy it. Thanks to the publishers. Yeah.
So one question, one contribution. So the contribution is around the example from China, the example that you brought from China and class formation in China. And I think I was interested in disruption being juxtaposed with construction and thinking about that in terms of class terms. What is often forgotten about China's rise in commerce is that new working class came into existence in China, and Ben says it is extraordinarily large on the back of the destruction of the existing what I would call the traditional urban working class, where depending on the figures you use, something between 30 and 50 million state-owned enterprise workers were laid off following the 1997 15th Party Congress and its policy of let go of the small, medium-sized state-owned enterprises and hold on to the large one, which of course the market took its own time and massive layoffs there. That leads me to what I hope the question is, what do you think about, what's your view on, and I think this is possibly following on from Dina's question, is around different processes of class formation in the global south, which haven't really haven't produced that. Yeah, maybe China's an exception, maybe Brazil is to a certain extent exception, but haven't produced a kind of less heterogeneous working classes that we normally refer to. And I'm thinking of, the cliche is 93% informality in India, etc. But that is symptomatic of stuff that has gone on around the world, and it's something that comes up a lot in class. So I'd be interested in how you respond to that in the context of your book. Lots more to say, but really interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim.
Great question again. Yes, Poppy.
We have a question from a member of our online audience. The question is, how do you analyze the tension between the scale of the global population that food systems must sustain and proposals to scale down global value chains? Do you see shorter value chains as a viable alternative?
Okay, should we and then we're going through this maybe final round of questions, but yes, please. So we have green transition, informalization and stratification of the working class, and the shorter.
Yeah, these are fantastic questions. Yeah. It's always great to be at SOAS.
Our favorite.
So Nancy's question about the contradictions of the green transition. So I've just finished this paper called, can't even remember the title. I think it's Revisiting Jevons Paradox, and then colon, the twin transition and systemic ecocide. Okay, because what Jevons talked about 150 years ago was that greater efficiency in energy use or resource use does not lead to less resource use, leads to more resource use, because greater efficiency equals greater profitability, more investment, expansion of markets, more demand, and so on, which is a fundamentally great insight. I don't know what went wrong with Jevons. He became this neoclassical economist, but I think he made that point before. But that's a really amazing kind of insight, which is lacking in the environmental upgrading literature and is lacking in much of the green transition literature. And so what I show in this paper is that these great new efficiencies, AI and digital technology, it can do, at the unit level, it can do quite amazing things. So one example is, the so-called last mile. If you do supply chain management, you'll be learning about the last mile in logistics. We produce this amazing good, we need to get it to the storage center, but the last mile you get there and the roads are all blocked up. But what we'll do now is we can use AI to find a better way to get there to the shops, and that will save on energy use and reduce pollution, which is true. Similarly, using the Internet of Things can facilitate understanding of kind of preemptive maintenance. So when an oil well is drilling, you lose a lot of time and energy when something goes wrong. But preemptive maintenance, you can fix it before it goes wrong. And there's all these new efficiencies emerging. Okay, and I'll just make the really simple point that goes back to Jevons, which is that these greater efficiencies leads to unit efficiencies equal greater aggregate energy use and greater destruction. And so I make the point that it's not ecocide in terms of the Russian bombing of the dam in Ukraine or Israel's ecocide in Gaza and genocide in Gaza. It's not just these individual shocking events. It's a systemic process that is rooted in capitalism and is being boosted by the twin transition. So there, for me, is the real paradox, and it's a horrible one at that. And I think you could, if you, and this comes back to the labour question and policy. If trade unions were really actively involved in saying, okay, now this technology is here, we want to have a seat at the table, we want to use this technology to reduce the working day, to reduce the amount of work we have to do, and to increase our leisure time, which Keynes promised us and Rostow promised us. It's always there, the promise is always there, it never arrives. We want it now. This technology exists, rather than using it to shorten the kill chain and this kind of stuff. So there is the that's an element of that. Tim's point, I think it's a really great point. We do talk about the let go of the small, grab the rich, etc. We talk about that. We talk about the massive unemployment. And I think this comes back to the previous point about the attempt of us to talk about uneven development and trifurcation, because of course China's new working class is one side of the coin, but you also have it's also quite precarious, but you also have the fragmentation of labour, the classes of labour that Henry Bernstein talks about, which is in a sense the other side of the coin of, on one hand, an expanding global system, so global working class, on the other hand, huge concentration of capital in some parts and a fragmentation on the other. And Marx talks about this when he talks about concentration of capital. He says the effects of the concentration of capital are these large firms on one hand and a proliferation of kind of immiserated type of labour conditions on the other. I think that's another, to answer your question in a way that I'm not really answering, I think that's another great area for research. And then Poppy, you mentioned shorter supply chains in the global food system. And this is from someone watching, online. I think the food system has to be fundamentally rethought. It's so wasteful. I mean, the feed meat complex is a massive waste of resources. When you're thinking about 6 to 8 to 10 kilos of grains for 1 kilo of beef, this is a total waste. and the water and the land and the logistics and the plastic and the fossil fuels, all of that, you add all of that together, and 1 kilo of beef, the way it's produced in these in this livestock, intense livestock ways of producing things is ecocidal. We're not these kind of fundamentalists saying we have to force everyone to be vegan, because when you force people to do things, it's not going to work. But I know I certainly wouldn't be talking about pushing pastoralists to become vegans. No, not at all. But I think in a country like the UK, where something like 85% of agricultural land is dedicated to livestock, the opportunity cost is intense. We could have lovely public commons of verdant land, of kind of rainforests in this country, instead of these private monocultures. We could have ways to make our land much more resilient to the ravages of climate change. We could be producing more of the fruit and vegetables we eat in this country rather than having to import them. And we could be doing so in ways that are actually contribute to people's well-being, not just through consumerism, but through actually participating and having access to the commons and so on. So I think I've written about transforming the food system. I've written this article called The Green New Deal for Agriculture Within or Against Capitalism. And I think the answer is in the title. You can imagine which one I'm arguing for. And I think there's a huge scope for re-envisaging and reworking the food system. And I think, this war may be the moment where people actually wake up in this country, because food prices are going to go up. They're going to be even more miserable than they are already because of the cost of living crisis. And Reform will say, oh, well, we just need to get rid of more immigrants. But then the Greens are going to say, actually, we can restructure the food system, provide good, healthy food for all at cheaper prices and with a much lower environmental footprint.
All right. Yes, Naomi. And then do we have any? Yes. Hi.
And there's more online as well, I think. So I'm Naomi Hussain. I work in SOAS Development Studies Department. And I wanted to know, Ben, when you present this book at the World Bank and in the World Economic Forum, I mean, what response do you get from the people that you are criticizing? Or do you ever get to speak to them? You don't try, or you don't?
Well, you obviously know these people, so maybe you can put me in touch. I can offer to make them up a bit. Yeah.
Yes.
But is that something you would want to do?
Yeah. It'd be interesting case study. Yeah.
Be lovely to get the Economist to review your book.
Yeah. But I mean, they're these closed circles. They listen to their own type of people. They like the solutions that they know already. They don't like anything too critical. For them, thinking out of the box is impossible.
Okay, let me go. Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a student at SOAS, postgrad student, but my day job, I also work for a trade charity called Transform Trade. And I'm sorry to bring it back to policy, but it is about policy because I work in policy, I'm obsessed. So, we can't avoid it. I think it's interesting that obviously critique is for a critique's sake, it's very important. And obviously we can kind of look at different facets. We look at the food system and how that could be fixed, etc., etc. But on a kind of macro scale, right? Like what are the levers that we have to reform capitalist value chains, right? Like what's the role of multilateral institutions? So kind of I guess a bit of a follow-on from, is there a role for them, or do they just need to be completely abolished? This is like big picture thinking stuff, but this is not new because there are social movements who've been saying, like, across the world, who've often united to kind of build alternative visions for the economy, and often they include things like relocalizing trade or regionalizing trade, breaking down these power structures within global value chains and kind of bringing the value back to the producers and the workers. So I guess I'm just asking for kind of reflections on that, and also how much do you engage with those social movements in this book? And then what are the kind of more macro solutions that aren't topic specific, I guess?
Great. And last question. Do you have a question? Yes. So two, but very try to be synthetic. Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Daniel, master student, University of Greenwich. The big question of economic democracy. I don't know. Do you think it's feasible within the capitalist value chain? And if it is, what would drive that? Would it be people, the structure, like government?
Okay, great. And
I'm a first year researcher at SOAS. The work's been really instructive because I'm looking at the Mexican government's interventions in the export-oriented sector. And like the 2012 work in Brazil points out the arrival of the horticulture sector in Brazil and the permanent working class of the bill allowed workers to transform structural power to socialist power, and the things that were able to accomplish social upgrading. I hate to be another person that asks a policy question, but given so much of governance of value chains is within firms rather than states. And I know you said that industrialization isn't necessarily the solution, but is there space for little countries to do industrialization project like, you know, there's a certain ceiling on institutional interventions you can pursue the labor market, but shaping these local industrial hubs in a way where Brazil, you build concentrated working classes and allow workers to build structural power. Because the thing I keep going back to is like it's nice to say, you know, dealing from value chain. Political settlement in these countries, it's not a feasible, tangible project to pursue in the absence of a mass movement. It's just, it doesn't seem like it's, I don't see where it's going to come from.
okay, so but to wrap up, you have another question? Yes, go ahead.
So I was just really following the discussion we had. Do you see any of the, because I'm less progressive as well. So do you see any of this evidence? Some of this company sector like might do better in terms of labor exploitation. I'm just saying like there might be a different practice in terms of different value chain, different company. Like there's a difference between the European company and American company. I guess there's a kind of like opportunity to see some of this company probably like implement better. I mean, I don't want to say ESG because it could be a bit of greenwash, but I'm just saying that
there is hope. Basically.
Yeah,
that's the
hope.
question.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
Great. And I have the last like utopian question, basically, which connects a little bit, but. So in the book, you not obviously, but that's your position that the state that's the interest of the capitalist class, okay? But at the same time, as a policy option, you end up saying that there is kind of economic democracy that could actually start at least to push towards a resistance from above, okay? Let alone, obviously, that we need like resistance from below and struggle from below. But do you think there is a sort of space where the state, due to the accountability and the civil war that we're actually facing, might have some sort of accountability issue and start to figure out that they need to re-engage with the social contract and provide some sort of basic needs? Do you think, please? Yeah, and then we stop. But thanks.
Well, if the Greens win, then yes.
Okay, we need just to make the other 189 countries in the world, but yeah, okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But I'll come back to that in a second, maybe. I mean, so Naomi, obviously I've had so many invitations for the World Bank, the economy, plans, etc. I'm waiting, I'm not going to hold my breath, but I'd love to speak to them. I mean, no, it would be fascinating just to see what their kind of objections would be. And I think the clearest line of attack, if I did go there, would be on the environment side, because with Labour, with capital-labour relationship, it's very different from the capital-environment relationship. There is an exchange, there is a contract, there is a nominal equality, and so even if workers are being screwed over, one could still argue, well, they're choosing to do so, they're voluntary going into that contract, they're earning more than they perhaps were, their parents were earning, and so on. And so there's some ambiguity there. I think with the environment question, there's zero ambiguity at all. But I'd see, okay, so Hannah, trade justice policy, macro policy. I mean, so macro policy, the new international economic order would be a good macro policy. Frantz Fanon said, not aid, reparations. You have screwed us over for hundreds of years, the colonial powers, you owe us. Like Germany paid some reparations to Israel, probably to massage its own ego and to make sure that, we're doing better now. We are post-Nazi, etc., even though the Nazis were still well in their kind of institutions. But he was saying that. So that would be macro policy. Another example, but none of this really happened. But something that did happen was the international commodity agreements in the 1960s and 70s, again, in the context of the Cold War. And this meant that things like coffee, I think rubber, sugar, some of the major commodities were selling at above market prices and weren't just determined by supply and demand. And this really did facilitate the kind of investments, the use of agriculture to generate surpluses, which could be invested in industry in a kind of intersectoral way that generated a relative amount of industrialization and so-called development in the global south, which was, compared to what came after, was quite successful. It was hard to compare it.
In relative terms, it wasn't ideal, but yeah.
No, exactly. So I think those would be, living wages would be really important. And then, so economic democracy comes up a couple of times, and I think the idea of economic democracy could have many things. You could have the idea that you have workers as, on the board. 50% of the board should be made up by workers. Why not? Well, capitalists invest their capital, workers invest their labor. Why not have 50-50? Obviously, to get there, it wouldn't be like, imagine you go to Bill Gates or so. Here's an idea. Oh my God, why didn't I ever think of that? Of course, actually, you can have 51%. Why not? It's not going to be like that. But that could be a policy. I don't know if that counts as policy, but I would see it as policy. I think it should be. For example, GB Energy that Ed Miliband is doing, I think he's one of the few Labour ministers who's got some kind of credibility. And his policy of GB Energy making, hopefully at some point, energy will be sustainably produced, renewable, and either very cheap or free. One thing that could be done there would be to democratize GB Energy and actually put it under workers' control, or at least have a kind of bicameral, that is, workers and capital at the table within the energy sector, to give workers a massive amount of structural power within the British economy. And this is something that people like Matt Huber are talking about in his book, Climate Change is Class War. I think that's a fair enough idea. And so this fits in with Daniel's question about economic democracy. I think it is. Yeah, it's a struggle, and that's the beginning and the end of it in a sense. But in between, there's all the kind of detail which each chain would have. But just to make this point, for example, so you mentioned about some firms being better than others. So in Europe, you've had the CSDDD, I think, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which was a way of trying to rein in value chains to an extent. And there's been a huge pushback against that by firms across the world. The big tech firms have got their industrial lobbyists to push back against concrete limits, or proper limits on the use of natural resources. So you can see that that's all predicated in a kind of critical Marxist analysis of the firm, the nature of the firm. But it does depend on policy, and maybe we'll get somewhere better. In terms of Mexico, one thing we point out in the book is that this is another irony of the upgrading. For Mexico to upgrade into American automotive value chains, first of all, it had to downgrade massively and destroy its national industrial automotive sector in order to become fragmented, and then it could start upgrading. But that downgrading is not theorized in the upgrading literature. So rather than saying we need to have a new automotive sector, I mean, even EVs are, very problematic in terms of environmental development. I think you can have progressive industrial policy. Absolutely. You can think about meeting people's needs, and you can think about kind of industrial policies that would facilitate meeting those needs in terms of clean energy and all of the kind of spillovers and all of the linkages that would be required in a place like Mexico to have free energy for all. So solar power and so on, wind power, water power, all of this could be part of an industrial strategy which would transform the economy and potentially give workers more structural power if they're engaged in the process of so-called governance of these new structures. So yeah, industrial policy is definitely, I mean, I'm all for progressive industrial policy. I'm not one of these people who say, no, we just need transition to socialism, end of capitalism. No, I mean, between here and there is, if we ever do get there, it's going to be a long time. And there's a whole range of kind of policies that we could do right now that could be very progressive. And for me, thinking about these kinds of policies is about policies that have a meaningful impact in terms of the environment and simultaneously boost workers' power and vice versa. So policies that boost workers' power organizationally, structurally, associationally, and lead to better rising living standards and greater environmental care for the planet. I think these things need to be thought of together. And I think there is a lot of good material out there that could lead to progressive industrial policy, even in countries with which are middle income spending constraints. And this comes to Lorena's point about the state. Yes, it's a capitalist state, but as people like Polantzas and others show, there is this struggle, and the state does respond. It needs to maintain hegemony, and it does respond through welfare states and so on, and this kind of stuff. So I think there is scope for shifting the state to some degree and pushing the state in a more pro-labor rather than anti-labor direction. At some point, that will reach its limits, but I mean, those limits are not, well, I mean, it's hard to say. Are those limits here now? I mean, is the onset of something like fascism, is that a reflection of the limits of social democracy and the fact that they feel the need to get rid of it? Maybe we have reached the limits. I mean, that's an open question. I'm not a politician. I'm not a organizer, strategically speaking. So, I kind of, I'll put these issues at the table. But I think there is space to push back against the state. How far it'll let us is another question.
Yes. Thank you very much to everybody. And thank you for those online joining, and we'll see you soon for the next seminar. Bye-bye. Thank you.